I want to talk about dealing with opinionated code reviews. So, code reviews happen frequently in software engineering. Basically, refers to when I, as a software engineer, want to push changes into the main branch. I'm going to make a pull request, which basically, if you're using GitHub, you'll be able to see all the changes in a diff against my branch versus whatever branch that I'm requesting the changes be merged into. So if I made a branch off of main and I make a pull request into main, somebody has to review those changes to get my code out into production, for lack of better words. So sometimes code reviews can be difficult because some people look for different things. Some people, well, really everybody, should look for bugs in the code as best you can. You should be looking for things like null checks to avoid object reference errors. You should be looking for logic that is succinct and there's not a lot of like if, else, like those kind of things. So if the structure of the code generally makes sense, you should look for things that maybe violate properly disposing of memory, and you should avoid having dependencies created directly in a class, those kind of things. Those are kind of standard across the board, just a general checklist of, okay, here are the things that everybody's going to check for. But on the other side of the coin of that, some people have their own criteria of things that they look for in a pull request, which can make it difficult for junior developers to assimilate into the team because they're not familiar with the standards that already exist. This is where it gets tricky because some people's standards are quite opinionated, if I'm being honest, and they're based on a number of sources, or they're just based on previous experience, what they saw at their last company from other people who may have gotten experience elsewhere. And sometimes these opinionated reviews may come out in the form of naming conventions for variables, what casing style you should use, particularly for variables like for .NET, like constants at the top of the file. For whatever reason, those are a hot topic for whatever reason. You can see some people do all caps, underscore. There's a whole host of things. Class names, structure of files, what folders should be called, namespaces even. And it goes as far as to even how you write code. So some people are really geared towards query syntax, and some people are geared more towards what is it called? Method syntax, I think. If you use .NET, you know what I'm talking about. It's with link. You can use anonymous functions, or you can use like more of like the select from where syntax. Some people prefer one or the other. And another one that may come out is dealing with the structure of conditions. So depending on if you choose to nest conditions versus having an early exit or early return, those kind of things. So there's going to be a whole host of these opinionated conditions that you're going to come across as you're making your way into this career that you'll have to figure out. And the best way I would suggest to figure it out is really just be upfront with the team to get a coding standards document or file and share it amongst everybody on the team. So that way everyone knows, the general things that you should adhere to in your code. Now, where this gets difficult is if it's a new team coming into an already existing system, which is probably going to be more often the case than not. Because a lot of times the team that made whatever you're working on is either not there at the company anymore or has moved on to a whole nother product. That's pretty common. Or they just got laid off. That may be the case. So if you find yourself in that situation and you're on a new team with with an existing system, you have to then figure out all these standards. And the last thing you want to have happen is when you make a pull request, whoever the reviewer on the team is for your specific pull request, is the last thing you want to have happen is have all the tests run, have everything tested by QA or whoever it is, and basically be ready to ship to production, but then get stopped because of a opinionated suggestion on your PR that holds up the pull request. And that can be frustrating, especially if you're not used to that. I know it was for me because it was like it represents a delay, right, in your work. It means that something by a more experienced engineer has held up your pull request, and now you have to go back and fix it. And it can be very frustrating if it feels like it's an opinionated change. And I understand completely if you're a junior developer coming into this field, not having the confidence to, kind of stand your ground against the pull request comment that you might get. Because it can be intimidating sometimes, especially if you don't know the space that well. Because you kind of, at least sometimes I feel like you can assume that whoever's looking at it just has more knowledge of the system than you do. But honestly, sometimes they don't. And I just would get in the practice of just having conversations about whatever comment you may have received on your pull request and just talking about it, because the team as a whole should be open to talking about whatever. If somebody's not open to talking about the changes that they're wanting you to make to your pull request, that could be problematic, because that means you don't have a healthy team dynamic and healthy communication. Because honestly, sometimes I know I've done this. When you put a comment on a pull request, I've gone back and looked at the comment I've put on there and thought about it more and realized I was wrong, and I I deleted it, or I sent them a message say, hey, actually I missed this other piece of code in this file that actually made this okay, so sorry about that, I'm gonna delete it. Just things like that you got to do, especially if you don't want to make somebody feel like put them on the defense with their code. Honestly, when you go to develop this coding standards document, which I think that every team should have, just so everyone's kind of on the same page about what people are looking for in terms of code and how code is written, I think that it's important that you leave some things open-ended, because some things don't matter. I would argue that one thing that does not matter, and this could be a hot topic, whatever, but I would argue that having an early return. So if you reverse the conditions, you say if this is false, then just return out of this method, rather than if this condition and then do these things, then you have an else return. Both of those things work, and they're identical code, except one is just having the return before that. There's a lot of debate on this. You can read code. Like, I think clean code suggests you have the early return, but that's not something I would hold up a pull request for personally. That feels to me like an opinionated change, and it's not something that I would ever hold up something for. So you're gonna have to figure out what you can leave open ended versus what really should be the standard. And again, if it's an existing system and there's already kind of predefined standards or patterns, it can be that much harder to create something that goes against that, because now you have two different standards within the same solution, which can be challenging and can make for awkward code. So I think it's something you're going to have to kind of just figure out on your team, and just take a kind of a check, like take a tally of what applications your team is responsible for, and just kind of, I would honestly break them down and see, okay, first of all, what is the code like? What does the code look like that we're working with? Is it good? Is it okay? And does it leave us room or flexibility to define this coding standards document? That's all I'm saying. Now, if you're working on something new, that's like best case scenario, right? We all want to work on something new. We want to make something from scratch. If you are in that situation, then it's going to be easier, or should be easier, to make some of those standards up front. Now, if you're someone who doesn't really care about like the super nitpicky standards, like naming of variables, classes, things like that, then you may be tempted to not do this. Like I personally, I kind of fall on the more loose area on this. I don't really care as much about names or like general structure of, like, I just I don't want to say I don't care, but I want to leave it open ended so people feel like they have freedom and flexibility to think for themselves. Because the last thing you want to do is make a checklist that everyone has to adhere to, and then they feel like they can't even think for themselves in the system. And it's again, I can't I stress that I'm talking about things that don't matter about like the quality of the system or like the legitimacy of like the code quality, like things that actually make the code work. If the code works and you're not doing stuff that's just crazy like anti patterns, then then go for it. Like that's kind of where I fall. Now, obviously, there's legitimate anti patterns that should be avoided. If you're working in .NET, you should be using dependency injection, and you should be avoiding using the new keyword as best you can when creating classes or inside of classes creating objects, because you don't want to create a strict dependency within that class. You should be using some form of dependency injection. Things like that, I'm not talking about. That should be followed, right? You should be using those things. So again, I think it's something that's important that you have a team discussion on with everyone involved, just to kind of see where everyone's at. Do people care? Even people might not care. I think you'd be surprised about what people don't care about, and sometimes it's something you should talk about, I guess is what I'm saying. Because when you put up a pull request, especially if you're just starting out, it's exciting because it's your first pull request into production. It can be kind of discouraging if you get negative comments on your pull request, or you get a lot of things that you have to change, because it can kind of reinforce that that inevitable feeling of imposter syndrome that you're gonna have, right? Because it's inevitable that you're gonna make silly mistakes. Just everyone does. I make silly mistakes all the time still. Like, I forget to maybe put an null check here or switch whatever around. That happens, and it's things like that that if you get called out on in your pull request can make you feel discouraged about your ability as a software engineer. But try not to look into it too much, is what I'm saying, and just be open to having conversations about the changes with the person who requested them. And honestly, sometimes it's beneficial just to get on a call and talk through it, even if you know how to fix it or you know how to remedy the problems that were brought up in your pull request. Sometimes it's just good to talk about it with somebody, just to make sure that you're both on the same page. And I think it's just healthy for the team, just to make sure that everyone is in good communication with each other. Because the last thing you want to do is request changes on a pull request, and the person making the changes doesn't agree with the comments but doesn't say anything. Now you have a point of conflict that is going to be brought up at some later time. I think that should be avoided. But again, code reviews probably one of the harder aspects of the job. Now, does it get easier? Doing code reviews is kind of like grading other people's papers in school a little bit. It doesn't really get easier. It just changes. The code just changes, the papers just change. You may get a little more familiar with what you should look for as you grow in the system, but largely it just the code, the files, the system, as it grows and matures, it just changes. And sometimes you'll be in a situation where you're doing code reviews and you really don't know what you're looking at. So then you have to get on a call and you talk through the changes. What do they do? What do they add? Have they been tested? And that part never really goes away. And I would say that's one of the larger time-consuming things about the job is code reviews, honestly, depending on how they're done. And depending on if the team has a QA position. If it doesn't, and the QA testing falls on the developers, then it really becomes a big burden because it's a large chunk of time out of our day to, as a team, make sure that it works. And I want to stress that I want to stress the fact that it should be a team effort in the sense that the team is responsible for a subset of whatever system you're working on. And if responsibility just falls to one developer, that's not good because if they leave, then the team is in a bad spot. I think the team as a whole should have the same knowledge about the system in general as best you can. And if it means that we set up more meetings to make that happen, I think it might be worthwhile. That's all I got for today. So I'll see you in the next one.